All right, so welcome to our last Brainworks education lecture, civic education, before we actually start past paper revisions. And we're going to talk about the major international human rights instruments. So you have to zero in on the definition of instruments. So an instrument is something that you can use it as a tool to achieve a specific objective, or you can use it as a tool to make life better for yourself as well as other individuals. So all these organizations and charters that we're going to be talking about today are being used as instruments or as tools to aid in the betterment of human rights. So the main focus will be human rights. So human rights instruments, like I explained, this refers to institutions and mechanisms that are used to protect human rights. They're used as the tools. And we have a wide range of examples. So in Zambia, people's rights, such as rights to life, the basic human rights, rights to vote are protected by the constitution and are also and by the judiciary. Hence, the judiciary and the constitution examples of human rights instruments. So because that body protects human rights, in and of itself, it's an instrument that protects human rights. So I can actually urge you to watch the video on citizenship and a little bit on human rights, then come to human rights instruments so that you can have the full picture as you progress throughout this lecture video and lecture series. So types of international human rights instruments. You have the first subcategory is International Bill of Rights. So we're going to be going International Bill, then charter-based, just like that. There should be about 3. So International Bill of Rights. So it's everyone, International Bill of Rights. This is made up of 3 main instruments. So then remember, this can be an MCQ question, so you have to pay extra attention here. So International Bill of Rights, 3 instruments, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which we mentioned in the past, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, ICCPR, and the International Covenant of Economic and Social and Cultural Rights. Then you also have things called specialized instruments, meaning they are only specialized in one aspect of human rights, because remember, human rights, it's a huge, wide spectrum. So when we say specialized instruments, remember, specialized in a specific category. Example, International Convention on the Elimination of all forms of racial discrimination. So here we are now talking about race as well as racism as a specialized subcategory of human rights. Convention on the Elimination of all forms of discrimination against women, women's rights. Convention against torture, Convention on the Rights of Children. So you can see how these entities are specialized. But take home, remember that the International Bill of Rights is made up of 3 subcategories: the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights, as well as social, economic, as well as cultural rights. So other than International Bill of Rights, you have something called like a charter. Remember we said a charter is a form of agreement. So now we have to look at these instruments that are written down as form of agreements or charters. So charter-based international human rights instruments. Charter-based international, so we're still talking about international rights, but these are now agreement-based. And the first subcategory, now we're going to go into the details of this. So International Bill of Rights, we're going to talk about all the details. So the first one is Charter-based International Human Rights Instruments and Agreements, Universal Declaration of Human Rights. You also have to know the year, 1948, because sometimes civic education can be specific. They can require a specific year and a specific name. So this instrument begins with the preamble, which is like a summary of the main content or an introduction. So the preamble states that the values and beliefs of this declaration, that is, so one, it came into force in December 10th, 1948. You can just remember the year. As a result of genocide that took place in Nazi Germany during the Second World War, you know, the killing of Jews that they called racial cleansing. And the Holocaust, sometimes call it the Holocaust as well as concentration chambers, quite inhumane. So this instrument is to prevent mass genocide of people in the future. So this is why you can see that, all right, the Ukrainians are still protected because of this charter. There isn't mass genocide. So the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, DHR, is an international recognized and agreed upon instrument through which individuals and governments can work to deliver the basic human rights. So the UDHR, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, contains 30 articles which form the basis of human rights, the intrinsic human rights from the time that you are born as well as the time that you die. Example of some of the contents. This states that everyone is born in a freedom, equity, and dignity. So everyone is born in freedom, equity, there should be a comma there, freedom, equity, and dignity. So equity is fairness. Everyone has the right not to be discriminated upon based on your religion, your political, your race, etc. Everyone has the right to life, the basics. Everyone has the right to security of person. Everyone has the right to effective remedy, so you need medication. Everyone has the right to recognition before the law. So at least know 5 or know all these 10, because it can actually form a basis for a short discussion or a basis for a long essay type of discussion. So now, other than charter-based rights, we now talk about treaty-based international human rights instruments. So where there was a treaty is also another form of an agreement. International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. So this came into force in 1966. Again, may be important or imperative to know these years because they can come as an MCQ. And the aim of this International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, unlike the UDHR, is that the ICCPR is legally binding to its member states. No wonder it's a treaty. It's more formal. It's just not an agreed upon standard, but it's legally binding. These are rights that are easy in nature to implement, as they require no big investment for them to be deployed. As usual, the same as the UDHR, you are going to have an introduction, a preamble. The preamble of this document states the idea of free human rights, the idea of free human beings enjoying freedom from fear, and wants can only be achieved if conditions are created in which everyone may enjoy economic, social, and cultural rights, as well as his civil and political rights. So if you go back to the video on human rights, you're going to know the categories of human rights. Please visit that video. It's very imperative that you watch that video. So these are the summary of the provisions, because remember, they are rights that can be implemented. No wonder it's a signed upon agreement, a treaty that's legally binding. Right to life, freedom from torture and humane treatment, freedom from imprisonment for debt, right to privacy, right to assembly, and right to a fair trial. So you can see that these instruments or provisions are legally binding, and they are also easy to implement. Then we have something called optional protocols. So this is a provision attached to an international human rights instrument in order to offer more protection. So you need certain optional protocols to ensure that there is extra protection. There could be certain miscellaneous, maybe a certain right like right to life. At least that definition is non-exhaustive. But you can have certain human rights, maybe freedom of expression, that cannot be fully exhaustive. So you might need to add an extra layer of protection to just encompass that definition and protect that human right. So the ICCPR, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, has two optional protocols. And these are the first optional protocol. This provision allows individuals to complain direct to the United Nations Human Rights Commission on issues of human rights violation contained in the ICCPR, provided they exhaust all channels of complaints, usually through the courts of law. So you can, again, there's red tape here. Another disadvantage of bureaucracy, where you can say you can report direct to the main body, but you have to exhaust all bureaucratic levels before you actually get to the main body. Zambia is a state party member to this protocol, which is the second optional protocol of 1990. This aim at the abolition of the death penalty. Zambia is not a state party to this. I don't think I've heard any death penalty cases in Zambia. But yet again, death penalty is a little bit controversial in nature. So now this is the subcategory C of international rights. So the International Covenant on Economic, Social, as well as Cultural Rights. So this is also an extract of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was also an effort to come up with legally binding documents. So you want a step to actually form a treaty, and it was formed in 1966. These rights are pragmatic because they are dependent on resources for their realization. So pragmatic, it means they may or may not be easily enforceable depending on the resources that are currently available in that sovereign state. As usual, there is always a preamble. The preamble of this document states the idea of free human beings enjoying freedom from fear and want can only be achieved if conditions are created in which people enjoy his or her economic, social, and cultural rights, as well as his or her civil and political rights. Again, that the subcategories of human rights, the human rights video. So summary of the provision: social, remember social at the individual level, economic at the national level. So you need to be productive. You need the right to work, right to just and favorable conditions of work, right to social security, and right to, no wonder in the States they call it a social security number or an NRSC number, Zambia, which gives you certain freedoms, and right to form and join unions, including the right to strike, which is very, very important. So now we did mention about these specialized human rights instruments that are specialized towards, because remember, these subcategories of rights have to be decentralized in a way to allow importance towards them. No wonder we have these specialized human rights instruments. The first one is the International Covenant on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination, and it was formed in 1969. All forms of discrimination. Very important, ladies and gentlemen. So it came into force in 1969, meaning from 1969 until 2022, it has to stand the test of time. So that's one of the categories of the strength of a human rights covenant. It has to withstand modernization and the test of time. It was drafted to draw attention to matters of racial discrimination, which are still rampant in the world. Even today, we still have racial slayers. Principal definition of racial discrimination. So if the question comes, which covenant was specialized to deal with racial, remember, pay attention to detail, racial discrimination, so it would be the ICERD. So principal definition of racial discrimination is any distinction, exclusion, restriction, or any performance based on race, color, descent, or nation, or origin, which has the purpose of impairing the recognition, enjoyment of an equal footing of human rights and fundamental freedoms in the political, economic, social, or any other rights in public. So that's the principal definition of racial discrimination. Regardless of your color or anything, you have the right to be on the same train, on the same bus, on the same plane, enjoying the same restaurants and equal work opportunities, and not be judged based on your race. So summary of provisions, you really have to know these summaries of provisions. Condemn racial discrimination as well as apartheid without certain ethnic groups. Prohibit the act of discrimination by individuals and groups of individuals. Assure everyone within your power, assure everyone within your powers adequate protection as well as remedies, because sometimes racism can break mental barriers and people can be psychologically affected to racism, and someone might actually need therapy. So you need protection as well as remedies. There are also remedies to actually diminish that these racial slayers through these same instruments. Undertake immediate and effective measures in teaching, educating, culture, and information with the view of combating prejudice and racial discrimination. So that ratio there was a typing error from the publishers. It has to be ratio, the one with the RACIA, RACIAL, ratio, not ratio. That's the mathematical one. So international convention. So the first one was on race. Now the second one is talking about women's rights. Unfortunately, guys, ladies, gentlemen, you are in an examination room. You have to know these things. Just trust your brain. Just tell your brain, I'm going to revise these videos, I'm going to study, and I'm going to start doing past papers, and I'm definitely going to that civic education exam and get my credits and get out of there. Minimum credits. This came about after the failure of the 1967 Declaration to eliminate discrimination against women. So at times, charters and agreements may fail to meet their agreed upon observations, and new organizations are born out of those monitoring and evaluation assessments. So it was observed that females still suffer the worst discrimination in social, economic, as well as their civil and political rights. This instrument was put in force in 1979 to directly do what? Interesting. So principal definition of racial discrimination. This is any distinction. Actually, we have to remove that. So that shouldn't be racial discrimination. It should be gender discrimination. This is any distinction, exclusion, restriction, or any performance based on sex, which has the purpose of impairing the recognition of enjoyment of an equal footing of human rights and fundamental freedoms, the political, economic, social, or any other right in public. So at least the suffix, the ending, is the same. So you just have to remove. So where there's racial discrimination, gender discrimination, performance based on sex. Where those rest, you just put sex. Then the rest, everything else is the same. Easy to remember it that way. So summary of provisions. So eliminate all forms of discrimination against women. At least you know these things you can remember. Establish legal protection, the rights of women on an equal basis with men. So equal basis on an equity basis with men. We move on. Convention against torture and other cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment or punishment, CAP. This was born on the 10th of December, 1984, and Zambia became a state party to this convention in 1998. So the aim of this instrument is to totally forbid torture, of which I feel like torture is still very rampant in Zambian prisoners' cells and systems. I've seen a lot of people being brutally beaten up by police officers, and that's borderline torture and shouldn't be allowed. So principal definition, torture is defined as an act by which severe pain and suffering, whether be it physical or mental, is intentionally inflicted on a person for such purposes as obtaining from him or her or a third party information or confession, punishment for an act he or she or a third party may have committed or is suspected of having committed. We have all seen this form of torture, I'm very sure. So summary of provisions, you have to prohibit torture. If you're apprehending someone, and they resist, you can use force to cuff them and throw them in prisoners, but it doesn't give you the right to start beating up someone. And not referrer. So this referrer, this means to send back a person to a country where he or she is likely to undergo torture. So keep them as silent figures. You have to punish torturers and educate citizens on the evil of torture. Because if you see a human being enjoying inflicting pain on another human being, then that's now borderline a mental illness. And if you are trained to enjoy inflicting torture on people, you need to seek therapy urgently. So Convention on the Rights of the Child. So we went from talking about race, talking about women, to talking about torture. Now we are tailoring down to talking about the child, regardless of gender. So Convention on the Rights of the Child. These books at issues on the rights of the child and considers children as individuals with equal status as adults. Equal status, you have the same rights whether you are an adult or a children or a child. Equity on all grounds. General principles of what's this organization called? CRC. This has to be in your memory. Convention on the Human Rights of the Child, CRC. So basic principles, best interest of a child. This means giving primary consideration to what the child wants. So basic interest of the child, if a child has sickle cell anemia and this child of sickle cell has Jehovah's Witness parents, and the child needs a blood transfusion on a regular basis to replace those sickled red blood cells with normal red blood cells so that they don't go into a crisis. It's the best interest of the child to transfuse those packed red cells. So this is what I mean by the best interest of the child. If another example is if maybe one of the parents are heavy drug addicts, they can be deemed not competent to keep the child, and the child can be taken away from them. So best interest of the child. Survival and development. These priorities, making a child develop his or her fullest potentials in all angles of life. That is personality, abilities, as well as talent. So child has a personality, abilities, as well as talents in order for them to contribute to social and economic development. So you need survival as well as development. Non-discrimination. This establishes that children's rights apply to all children without discrimination. They're not going to say this is a Muslim child and this is a Christian child. The Christian child is going to be favored over a Muslim child. You're not supposed to look at children in those subcategories. This is a Hindu child. There's no such thing. A child is a child. Participation. This commands respect for the views of children, for the curiosity of children. They know they are asking these and ridiculous questions, but they have to be valid. And it's part of participation, and they are molding their personality as well as their character. Isn't that the same thing? Anyway, so the International Convention on the Protection of the Rights of All Migrants migrant workers and members of their families. So migrant workers and members of their families. That's xenophobia in South Africa. Such organizations need to be applied. So this is meant to protect the rights of people working in a country which is not theirs. Sometimes people can even get a work permit to work abroad, and people will need protection. State parties are obligated to protect and seek judicial remedy to those migrant workers whose rights have been violated. For definition, this applies to all migrant workers and their families without discrimination of any kind of sex, race, color, language, age, etc. So summary provisions. Migrant workers shall be free to leave any state, including their own. If services are needed, they should be free to leave any state. Shall have the right to enter and remain in their state of origin at any time. So you have the ability to go back to your home state. Their rights shall be protected by the law and by their supporting embassies. None shall be held in slavery. Whether you are a journalist going overseas to do some form of investigative journalism, you are not supposed to be held in slavery. Shall have the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion, because it's a multicultural arrangement. Have the right to hold opinions without interference. You're just a foreigner, Kanazi. That's it like that. So how the convention defines rights which apply to certain categories of migrant workers and their families. Number one, frontier workers are those living in a neighboring country to which they return daily on at least once in a week. So frontier workers, so if you are living in close proximity, which allows you to easily travel, So you're called a frontier worker. Seasonal workers. So frontier workers may travel alone or in companion with their families. So you can also have seasonal workers. Are those people working in foreign countries during specific seasons, like harvesting or plantation season, so seasonal workers. Seafarers, so sea, something to do with sea transport. So are those employed on water vessels registered in a country other than their own. So workers on offshore installations. So offshore installations, meaning workers that are somewhere completely surrounded by water bodies. So are those who are under the authority of the country other than their own, so offshore. Itinerant workers are those who move from place to place in search for work. I could be an itinerant worker. Migrants employed for a specific project, because sometimes they need to employ brain drain. So you might need to consult other people from other than your home state. So are those employed by a country which is not theirs to conduct a service or construct a project. And there are those who are also self-employed. So these are people who are in the informal sector. So there are certain, I'm sure this is the last part. There are certain terminologies that you have to finally learn. And this can actually apply MCQs as well as one-word short answers. So monist countries. Pardon me, I was trying, because mono means one, so monist countries. These are countries that regard international law and domestic law as one. Dual these countries, so dual, so both international law and domestic laws are different. Francophone, the countries that were once colonized by France and are usually French-speaking. Treaty. This is a declaration made and agreed and signed by member state, and it's legally binding. Legally binding meaning it's something that has a legal effect on one breaking it. So there's a cause and effect. State parties, the members of states, the particular convention. An accede, this means the country signs to a covenant which was not part of the negotiation. Ratify, this means the country signs a covenant which was part of the negotiation. And optional protocols, so these are supervisory mechanisms on human rights that are not compulsory to member states to a particular covenant. So know all these terminologies and remember the types of specialized international human rights as well as their provisions. At least we've gone beyond half. We're on page 57 of 100 and something, 148 pages. I think we can now safely start going past papers so that you can be ready for your civic education exam. Continue to study. It has been Brainworks Education.